The first ministerial resignation of the new Labour government calls for the Prime Minister to resign, and an historic vote in the House of Commons. I'm Frank McKenna, and this is the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
Just it's all bigoted women.
Me and my friends sort of used to run through the fields of wheat.
You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
It will cost.
I know words, I have the best words, but there's no better word than stupid.
Welcome back to the Downtown Den Politics Podcast, everyone. It's me, Frank McKenna. I'm joined as ever by Jim Hancock and a middle-class woman of a certain age, Jo Phillips, and as well as those domestic issues that I've mentioned in the introduction there, we will be talking about international affairs as well, and much to discuss as far as that is concerned. But let's start at home, and let's start with that first ministerial resignation of the new government, and it was the Transport Minister, Lou Haig, who's fallen on her sword for what at worst was her trying to blag an upgraded mobile phone 11 years ago from her employer. That seems to me to be the very worst case scenario of what she was guilty of. But we are in a new age, a new government who promised a different approach to these sorts of things. And they said, we're not going to do what the Tories did, and you get caught doing something, then you pay the price. Now, was this a little harsh, Jo, or has Keir Starmer been right in accepting Lou Haig's resignation?
Well, I just don't quite understand, given that she said he knew about it when she was appointed to the shadow cabinet, and it seems as though it is not a secret. But you know, there are two questions here. One is, should she have been given a full cabinet role, and is her misdemeanor, if you like, not putting it in writing to the Propriety and Ethics Civil Service branch, in which case it's a sort of oversight because everybody seemed to know about it. I mean, there is no suggestion of criminal behaviour. She doesn't have a criminal record. She pleaded guilty on the advice of her lawyer, apparently, but you know, it's not on her record. And if she was applying for a job anywhere else, she wouldn't even have to disclose it. So I think it was a bit harsh. I suspect there's more to it than meets the eye. And it's all very well being seen as ruthless, but not if it then raises questions about your judgment in the first place.
The bar seems to have been set low for a resignation, yeah. It seems to me, because as Jo said, okay, she did plead guilty to this offence. I think it was in 2011, I think. Yeah. And she wouldn't be the first young woman to make a guilty plea as advised by a solicitor when you're told, listen, you better just letting this go away. So, as I say, it seems that people who perhaps haven't followed the story as carefully as we have, Lou Haig, as a private citizen, was mugged and had a number of items stolen from her during that mugging. Within the items listed as being stolen, she said her work mobile phone had gone, and then apparently she claims that she found that phone later on, maybe a week or two after the initial mugging. She didn't, though, at least immediately report that to the police. The police discovered the fact that the mobile phone had been switched on, because that's what happens. These stolen phones are tracked. She was called into the police station and eventually, as Jo said, pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor. That charge, though she was found guilty, is now spent. And as you rightly say, Jo, if she was applying for any job anywhere, it wouldn't need to be declared. So, Jim, what was your take on this?
Well, first of all, to deal with the minutiae of this, and one needs to be careful, but there are suggestions that the photograph of the mobile phone was taken after the mugging. I do raise the issue of your work mobile phone and you find it 2 weeks later, isn't it more likely the mobile phone was, in a clearly visible place? Well, we're asking
but
for
I think, Jim, what I don't want to get into here is, well, okay, let's say that, as I say, the very worst thing that she's done is over 10 years ago tried to blag a new phone for an employer. That's the offence. Okay, and if she was guilty of that, that's what she was guilty of. So do you think that's a resignation issue?
No, I don't, and I'll
No,
move
well,
on.
there you go then.
I'll move on to the politics of this. Lou Haig was a left-winger in a basically Starmer government. She was probably appointed because Starmer and his people felt they needed one or two left-wingers in the cabinet. She blundered over P&O ferries, nearly sabotaged a major international investment conference, and they've taken an opportunity to get rid of her. Let's get down to the politics of this.
But does that not give him a problem in future if one of his rising stars, let's put it that way, or one of the people who are really close to him, are caught in a minor discrepancy, and this is a minor discrepancy? Well, what does he do in that case? I mean, he just seems to me to be potentially, at least, does Keir Starmer, setting himself up for future difficulties.
Yes, well, this broadens it. Can I just finish off? This broadens it out even further. It's beginning to appear that Keir Starmer is at heart a lawyer and not a politician. So that when he was sort of confronted with the Lou Haig thing on Thursday night, he looked at it in a legal way rather than, as you say, the political way, storing up all sorts of political problems for himself in the future. And I think that's when we broaden out this discussion to the economy and things like that, that Starmer's got a real problem, that he's very sort of focused on legal things. He's not particularly a politician, and he's really struggling with the day-to-day events of politics.
And sorry, if she's seen as left-wing, Lou Haig, because I vaguely know her, I don't know her well, met her a couple of times, but she never struck me as being somebody who was going to be particularly rebellious. Again, the comments that she made about P&O ferries, timing-wise, wasn't great because, of course, they happened when that big investment summit was taking place. But nonetheless, there was little you could argue with in terms of the behaviour of P&O ferries when they got rid of all those workers. And for me, Joe, as I say, I think he's just storing up future difficulties for himself.
Well, and, he could have given her a junior ministerial role. If he wanted her, he didn't have to put her in a full cabinet secretary role. And I just find it astonishing. I mean, he knew that case about the phone. He knew her politics might be to the left of him. But she had very good relations, which were very badly needed with the rail unions, although there are questions about whether she signed off the pay deal without asking for changes, reforms to working practices. And I think, as you say, Frank, I think it's ridiculous, because if that minor misdemeanor from such a long time ago, before she was even an MP, and didn't cause her to lose her job, by the way, at Aviva, she wasn't fired.
No.
So you sort of think, well, okay, what about? And I know whataboutery is a ghastly political game, but then what about, Angela Rayner taking her then partner to Wahid Ali's flat in New York? What about Rachel Reeves, CV, etc., etc.? Nobody is going to be purer than the driven snow. And I just think again, I think Jim's absolutely right. He's more of a lawyer than a politician. And therefore, as we've said before on this podcast, he's not instinctive. But you sort of think, so make your appointments, go for safe appointments, and bring these people in at a lower level, see how they perform, you can promote them. But once you sack them, what are you saying? I made a mistake, or I'm a ruthless bastard?
I think there's an opportunity for her to potentially come back because she was quick to resign. And again, if you believe what you read in the papers, may have been Morgan McSweeney who wielded the knife rather than Keir Starmer, but that is, again, just rumour. I'll tell you what is her replacement, and we should also mention the fact that Lou Haig was the youngest female cabinet member ever appointed, I think, to a cabinet position. So it's a shame that she's only lasted for such a short period of time. But her replacement is Heidi Alexander, who, again, I know a little of because she's done a couple of events for us in London. She was the Deputy Mayor for Transport under Sadiq Khan, knows the brief well, former Member of Parliament, so she's certainly not a rookie, won't be fazed by the job, I'm sure, and probably is seen as more centre-left than soft-left, which I'd probably describe Lou Haig as. So a more, more like Starmer than Lou Haig, perhaps. So a good appointment there, I think, and we'll see what she does with that massive brief, because it is going to be such an important part of what the government are trying to do over the next 3 or 4 years, isn't it? Transport.
I mean, one other thing I think we ought to mention is the speed of it. I think there is an obsession now with getting these things over to avoid the agonising days of coverage. And I think the Starmer people were probably worried that the longer it went on, the more his judgment would be called into question. So I think the question of speed. She was a bit protected, I understand, by Sue Gray and McSweeney, perhaps less so. That may be another explanation. I don't think she will be back. So there we are, hostage to fortune for all downtown podcasters to watch Hancock's latest humiliation. But let me go for it.
Yeah. Well, Dan Hodges would have been on, day 999 of the Lou Haig scandal.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, I think you're right in that. And the one final point I'll make on this, and you guys may have an opinion, you may not, but doesn't it add to the difficulty that people now have in putting themselves forward for elected office? If you were a young woman thinking about running for Parliament or even for a council seat, let's say, and you look at this story, would you not think, wow, if that's as little as you have to do for it to be a career-ending matter, then I really can't be arsed.
No, absolutely. And the thing is that, if you were upfront about it in the first place, which I gather she was, this isn't something that's been unearthed that she was trying to keep secret. And I know, as I'm sure you both do, that when people are being selected as parliamentary candidates, you basically take them into a dark room and say, tell us your secrets, because if you don't tell us, the press will find out, your enemies will find out. And it's astonishing what people go, oh, well, if you put it like that, when I should tell you about the affair I had with, X, Y, Z and so forth. And that's actually true. But, you sort of think, where's the vetting process? Is the vetting process enough on the, have you got anything that is likely to embarrass us? And, the answer is, in her case, well, not anything that you don't already know about.
And not anything not anything that we should worry about either. And, again, I'm with you, Joe. The whataboutery it doesn't take you very far in one sense. But when you look back at the Johnson era, for example.
Oh, well, exactly.
Can you imagine somebody from his cabinet having to resign for something as trivial? But Jim, just go back to that point. People now, we are struggling to find parliamentary candidates right across the political spectrum. And this sort of thing, I don't think helps with that.
No, but there is a premium on public behaviour. There is a perception that the public behaviour of politics. I mean, the two things seem to be running rather strangely in tandem. A very stringent examination of every indiscretion you committed as a teenager or as a student at university, but bad behaviour still prevailing at the top of politics on both sides of the pond. So it's a bit strange, really. I take your point. We'll never know the talented people who've been decided not to go into politics, and we always go back to the Jack Kennedy example. I'm absolutely fascinated as to how long Jack Kennedy would have lasted with his colourful private life, and yet he's held up as a hero of democracy, which he was in many ways, but how he would have survived this modern age of the media. It's a fascinating question that you raise.
Yeah, well, maybe we're just asking and expecting too much of our politicians. And thank goodness, Joe, that I won't be standing for any parliamentary seats anytime soon, because I will be in that darkened room for many hours.
Anytime soon. You heard the weasel words.
Yes.
Oh, never rule it out. Never say. Right, let's come back to the Conservative Party then, and Kemi Badenoch, who's been in place now for a couple of months. She did her third Prime Minister's question time last week, and in that performance at the dispatch box, she called on Keir Starmer to resign and wanted another general election. Well, she's gone a bit early, Jim, hasn't she?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You know, that is something you save up 2 or 3 years into your office, into the leader of the Conservative Party, when there's a real crisis on and it has real conviction. To fire ammunition so early is ridiculous, as is this petition, you know, for a general election. I mean, we just need to get that lady from Bristol again. What, not another one? I mean, it's ridiculous. And for her to latch on to that does show a little bit of lack of judgment, in my opinion. You know, she needs to focus on developing her policies, getting known to the country, and it is going to be a steep uphill task. I mean, there has been some commentary already that she's being ignored. Well, surprise, surprise. You know, people aren't stupid. They know they're not going to have to think about what the Conservatives are going to do for 3 or 4 years. That doesn't mean you can't start setting a general tone and preparing people. But in terms of specifics and so on, people aren't interested. And, you know, I think calling for resignations and elections is really, really silly. We're not even out of this old year yet.
And to add insult to injury, Joe, she also said during the same session, we, as in the Conservative Party, did a budget in March, and we didn't have protesters from the farming community in Westminster. Well, talk about short memories, because not only did we have protesters in Westminster from the farming community, they were protesting about Kemi Badenoch, who as Trade Minister did deals with New Zealand and Australia that they say is damaging the agricultural industry. So short memory and poorly advised, or maybe just poor instinct politically in terms of calling for a general election 4 months after we'd had one.
This whole thing about calling for a general election is beyond pathetic. And the idea that a petition started by some publican in Warwickshire or wherever it comes from, you know, and now backed by Elon Musk, I wish he'd butt off, you know, and Nigel Farage. Those are the same people who, when 6 million people signed a petition asking for the referendum on Brexit to be overturned or rerun, said, no, we must honour democracy. The same people who, you know, over 1 million people marched against war in Iraq. It didn't make a blind bit of difference. I mean, actually, Kemi Badenoch, as the leader of His Majesty's opposition, has a duty to say, I am here to defend democracy. You know, we've had a democratic election. We are here to hold you to account. She would be much more plausible, but she just looks like and sounds like somebody who's got to the sixth form debating society and has now gone on to university and is way out of her depth. And, you know, who knows what they stand for, because all they're doing is yaboo politics.
They've set up a policy commission to look at what they should be setting their stall out in terms of the next general election. I'd have thought she'd have wanted that commission to run for at least a couple of weeks before she demanded that the Prime Minister go to the country. So at least they had some messaging to put out there. I'm already hearing noises of discontent from Conservatives, some of whom supported Badenoch, who are now saying to me, I think we may have made a mistake. So watch this space, but not the most auspicious of starts for the leader of the opposition, and not the most auspicious of starts, we would say, for the government necessarily. But of course, Keir Starmer is going to reset the government this week, and we await with bated breath to see what he has to say. I think that speech is going to be made on Thursday, and we're told that he's going to put a bit of flesh on the bone of these 5 missions which he presented to the country for the poll on the 4th of July. So we will turn our attention to that in our next podcast next week. I want to spend a little bit of time on what was a very good day for Parliament on Friday, because a packed House of Commons talking about a very sensitive issue of assisted dying. The bill eventually passed by 55 votes, which I think was a greater margin than many anticipated. But the debate, by and large, was very courteous, very thoughtful. I thought, as I say, did the House of Commons great credit. And the most telling thing at the end, when the vote was announced, no cheering, no histrionics, simply the vote was called, and MPs at the end came together, shook hands, hugged. A very, very sensitive issue. And I know that both Joe and Jim have views on this. I'll start with you, if I may, Jim.
Well, one has to respect democracy. There is speculation that the details of this might wear down some people, and with a majority like this, only 25, 27 MPs who have to change their mind to stop it. But it's extremely rare for a private member's bill that gets endorsed in this way not to get to the statute book. Sunday trading in the dying days of Margaret Thatcher is cited as an example, but generally speaking, we must presume now that this will go to the statute book. And I have to accept that with good grace, and I absolutely endorse everything you say. The silence after that vote was most unusual, and no triumphalism from either side was absolutely appropriate. But I will continue to make my case, and on the detail of this, there are questions being asked about. The two parts of the government that are going to be required to implement this, the National Health Service and the judiciary, when I last looked, they didn't exactly have a lot of capacity to take on this new task. So there are serious questions about how or if the NHS is going to deal with this. I mean, is it going to be done within the NHS? I don't want to go into a hospital and see, physiotherapy this way, dying unit that way. Or is it going to be done outside the NHS? Are people going to have to pay for it? There are all these sort of questions. And something else that was raised by a family member of mine, it may seem like a detail, but obviously the drug is going to be a lethal drug. And if it's going to be administered in the home, I mean, a doctor is going to have to stay there. There's going to be absolute security on these lethal substances that are going to be in existence. So there's a whole lot of things to be considered. And my last point is on the slippery slope. Now, I know this isn't part of the scope of the bill, but I was absolutely appalled and astonished to see an article in the Mail on Sunday from a columnist called Dr. Ellie. And she said, I see patients in my surgery who are not suicidal or depressed, but believe life is burdensome and would give it up if offered an easy, painless way out. Should we not also consider offering people in their twilight years the chance to die at a time and place of their choosing? Is this something you would consider? Now, obviously, everything can be debated, but in terms of my fears about this broadening out, and you might say to me, well, it's not within the scope of the bill, but it's the fundamental change in the attitude to the later years of life that continues to concern me. But I respect the democratic vote.
Joe?
Well, I agree with everything you said about the behaviour of the House of Commons, and I think, we need more of that. We need more dignity, courtesy, respect, and listening. And I think, both you and I, Frank, were in favour of it. My son's a paramedic, and I was talking to him about it the other day, and he said the most important thing is that it's put palliative care on the agenda for people to talk about. And palliative care is not actually just about pain relief. It's about making people comfortable. And, somebody who is terminally ill at home will very often be given something like a morphine drip that they can control the dosage of. So I think we have to have faith in health professionals who will be involved in this. They're not stupid, and they're by and large not nasty. And they will, doctors have been talking about this, and they've said, it's the thing that somebody says as they're going out the door. They've come in for a bunion, and as they go out the door, they say, I've got this strange pain, you know, in such and such. And then they start having tests, which is one of the problems of people not seeing doctors during COVID and lockdown. So I do think, you know, it requires sensitivity. And I think we must have faith in the people who do the job, who are very often called upon by patients in extreme pain to put them out of their misery, and they won't, and they can't, and they, you know, they honour that. And I think, you know, as it goes through its procedure to get on the statute books, and I think it will be interesting to see what happens in the Lords, and we may see the Lords, often criticised quite rightly, come back into what it should be, with experts of long knowledge of the judiciary or medicine or science or ethics. So I mean, I think it's, you know, it's a turning point for this country, and it's an important conversation. And I think, you know, we all need to listen to each other on these issues of sensitivity.
And it's not going to be legislation that's passed in its current form. It will be, I'm sure, scrutinised really carefully, as you say, initially by the House of Lords. There'll also be select committee conversations, and when Kim Leadbetter brings that bill forward, or whatever form the legislation takes, then I think it will look different to what it does now. And we'll take account of some of the concerns that Jim has raised, because I was horrified looking at some of the stories from, I think it was Belgium or Holland, where children were being administered with lethal injections. And you think, well, you know, children sadly cannot be given that responsibility, surely. But they're the sort of safeguards that we would need to see in this country. But I go back to the point I made last week, and, you know, I've seen too many people suffer terrible, terrible, painful, undignified death. And I think that we've got to start to come to terms with the fact that as people are living longer, it doesn't necessarily mean they're living a quality of life that is substantial enough to justify them being denied the opportunity to say, I've had enough. And I mentioned my dad, but uncles in the same way. Victoria's granddad was in an awful state as well. And it's that loss of dignity that really hurts families.
Absolutely.
And hurts the individual. You know, if you'd have said to my dad, do you want to live and have your nappy on again? Then I tell you now, he'd have took a bullet to his own head if he'd been given the opportunity. So I absolutely accept what Jim said. We have to get the balance right. We have to be careful, because it's a big step to take. But my own experience and the experience of my family members and friends tells me that we just cannot simply go on the basis that, well, some people may fall through the cracks of this legislation. The other thing I have to say, Jim, is sorry state if we can't actually find the resources to allow people to have a dignified exit from this world. And it's not an excuse, in my opinion. It's no reason why we should say to people, no, you can't have that because we haven't got the money for palliative care. We haven't got money for the courts. Well, we can make that excuse about almost any decision that we want to take in this country at the moment. So for me, yes, you know, finesse the legislation, put those safeguards in place. But really, really great credit to Kim Leadbetter for the way in which she approached the whole thing, because she was very careful in terms of the way she expressed the views that she did. And as I say, huge credit to the House of Commons for coming together in the way it did and having that sort of discussion and debate in a way that Joe said it. Be nice to see on many, many other issues, but sadly I can't see that happening. Right, just
on a political level, do we feel, because some people are saying that this is going to cause further problems for Keir Starmer, it's going to sort of suck the life out of other issues? I mean, do we give any credence to that this is going to become a major distraction for the government vis-a-vis all their other policies?
Well, it's up for them to manage it. isn't it? And the leader of the House, Lucy Powell's got a big job in terms of ensuring that this goes through in a way that doesn't suck the life out of the government, as you put it, Jim. And to be fair, not the best analogy you've ever used on a subject, I have to say, but to be fair, you could say that was the case in the run-up to the vote. You know, it almost did take all of the airspace. But I actually think that the way in which the debate was conducted will help the future passing, or the future procedure of this legislation. So, in answer to your question, I don't think it will, but I absolutely see your point. It potentially could, and a big job for Lucy Powell and her opposite number to ensure that it doesn't do that, because it's too important to be used as a political football. And it's an issue we will come back to on the podcast. And I know that from this week conversations I've had from people who listened last week to the podcast, that there are varying views out there. So, you know, it's a difficult one. It's a difficult one. Right, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to be talking all things international. And we've had a lot going on, haven't we? We've had Joe Biden pardoning his son. We've had an Irish election. We've got the French government in trouble already. So much to discuss. Stay with us. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to the Downtown Den Politics Podcast Part 2, and we're going to turn our attention to international affairs. Just to remind you, my name's Frank McKenna, joined by Jim Hancock and Joe Phillips, as I've described in the first part of the programme. It's a woman of a certain age, middle class to boot. So there you go, Joe. We'll let you kick off on your opinion. Joe Biden's decision to pardon his son, who, of course, was found guilty of a number of misdemeanors, far more serious than what Lou Hague was accused of. I am really pissed off with Joe Biden, and I think he's destroying, slowly but surely, what should have been a great political legacy. Because not only did he hang on to the keys of the White House for far too long, making it, well, as we saw, an impossible task for the Democrats to fend off Donald Trump and his second presidency. But now he's basically giving every Republican in America the opportunity to say, you guys, you're whiter than white, and look what your president has just done. There's one rule for you and another for us. Joe, I am absolutely appalled at what Biden has done.
Yeah, me too. And I think it's two fingers up to his own party. It's two fingers up to everybody who worked so hard to try desperately to get or keep Donald Trump out of the White House, not necessarily to get Kamala Harris elected. And, he didn't have to do it. And his arguments are exactly the same that Donald Trump has used and will use to let people out of prison who, rioted on January the 6th. And I think it's absolutely shocking. I mean, the Democrats have got a lot of soul searching to do. And it's a real shame, because Joe Biden will go out having been, a man of considerable stature over decades in America and a very, very distinguished career in politics. And he'll go out as a silly, doddering, bitter old man who didn't know when it was time to go, and then made this final move, which is just ridiculous. And there is no argument against it. However much all of us as parents would feel the same, it's just ridiculous. You can't do it.
And of course, he did say he wouldn't pardon Hunter Biden when he was asked. So he's not only done something that we find, very distasteful, but he's gone back on his pledge. Jim, it does make the whole American political system look ridiculous, doesn't it?
Well, the American judicial system is completely ridiculous. It was beforehand, and it's now being implemented. I mean, I've never agreed with this pardoning system. I mean, Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon. You either have a judicial. I mean, imagine in this country if the Prime Minister could pardon people. I mean, just even think about it. The big thing about this country is that the judicial system and the political system are completely separate and independent. And in the United States, the whole thing is compromised. I mean, nobody's got clean hands on this. Obama pardoned people, Clinton pardoned people. But this particular thing is really egregious. I mean, obviously on a human level, Joe Biden lost one child to a car crash, another to cancer. You can sort of see that aspect of it. But this is just a selfish indulgence at the end of his presidency, and I agree it has besmirched it. But the more serious thing is that he said in reply to Trump's continual allegations that the judicial system was being politicized, oh no, that can't happen. And now he's saying, I'm pardoning him because my son was subject to politicization in the judicial process. So it's completely shot through. And it is a sad end to a man who's given great public service to the United States. But we can stand by now for. I mean, I was wondering what Trump was going to say, because he needs to be a little bit careful. He has criticized it, but of course he's about to, as you've said, Joe, about to do exactly the same thing with the January the 6th people, but he'll do it with his usual bluster and so on. I just wondered whether he'd keep quiet about it and just get on with his pardoning of the people that stormed the White House, but stormed the Congress. But yeah,
not his way, really, is it? To keep quiet about it.
No.
But you think it's baked in almost with Trump anyway. So the Democrats have been on this crusade of, we are the party that uphold the law. We are the people who abide by the Constitution. We are the part, and Biden just blows her out the water. And as I say, his political judgment had not standing down far sooner than he did. He should have resigned, or he should have announced that he wasn't going to stand in the midterms. And again, when you're listening now to the aftermath of the election defeat, senior Democrats are saying that actually he said to them, I will be a one-term president. Like so many people, he smells the power and it's like, oh, I want to cling on to it. So he has, as I say, sadly, he's destroyed what should have been a fantastic political legacy. And this, for me, I don't think there's any excuse. I don't think you can. And again, you can talk about the whataboutery, well, Trump's going to do this, and Barack Obama did that, and Bill Clinton, and they've all pardoned people. We know this. That's what presidents do. But I can't remember anyone pardoning a relative, and particularly not after you've absolutely guaranteed that you wouldn't. So I'm afraid Joe Biden is off my Christmas card list.
Yeah,
he'll be devastated. But not good for progressive politics, because not only does this impact on the states, because it's such a high-profile thing, you absolutely know that people in this country and across Europe will be saying, look, these liberals, they say one thing, but look what they do. They do something totally different. So no, plague on you, Mr. Biden. You're an absolute disgrace, sir. Anyway, let's move to an election closer to home, which was in Ireland, and a couple of things struck me here. All of the political parties lost support, including Sinn Féin. The turnout was, I think, 51%. It was really, really low. Plague on all your houses seems to be the message from the people of Ireland. And it looks as though you're going to have this grand coalition of Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael. Once again, Sinn Féin might try and cobble together something with Labour, the Independents, but I doubt it. Is this a significant result, Joe?
Only in the sense that I think it's a part of what is happening around the world, with a few notable exceptions of people are just going, they've had it with politics. And the people that do bother to go out tend to they either go for extreme change or they go, can't be asked, we'll stick with the same thing. It'll be the same old, same old. I mean, Sinn Féin's loss of support, I think, is quite significant in the longer run. And there may be a sort of shifting of the political sands, but I don't think it's going to make a huge difference. But I do think there is a real crisis in democracy And, you know, as we said in the first half of this podcast, if people think, oh, well, I don't like the results, so let's have a general election. You know, I'd love to know how many people have signed that petition and actually bothered to go out and vote in July. You know, whereas you've got people in Georgia, for instance, genuinely, really rioting on the streets because their election was fixed. And we just take it so for granted, something that is so precious and that, you know, people around the world will fight and die for, and people did in this country as well. And I think we desperately, desperately need a reset. And unfortunately, whether it's Joe Biden pardoning his son or Keir Starmer making screw-ups, you know, as he has over the past few months, or Boris Johnson, or Liz Truss, or, you know, name anybody anywhere, the politicians that we've got, by and large, don't inspire hope and faith in democracy. And it's corruption, it's lack of interest. And I think the Irish election result is an indication of that, really.
And a lack of faith, as you say, Joe, and perhaps politics being able to deliver for people in its current form. And that is a concern. Jim, I don't know how closely you followed the Irish election. As I say, I didn't follow it massively closely once I realised that there wasn't likely to be any dramatic change. 12 months ago, Sinn Féin, just to inform listeners who will follow it even less than we do in a sense, Sinn Féin were way ahead in the polls. And of course, that's significant because they want Irish unity. So had Sinn Féin won a big majority, then that would have caused ructions. But they've fallen away as well, on the back of, ironically, some corruption within its leadership, much the same way as the SNP have lost support in Scotland. So, Jim, do you have similar thoughts to Joe?
Yes, I have been following it, and I have to thank a gentleman that some podcasters might have remembered, my old producer at the BBC, Liam Fogarty, who was the local government correspondent.
A great scholar of Irish politics, isn't he?
A great scholar of Irish politics. I once gave him as a present the entire Irish local election results from 1920, which probably says more about me than about him.
Mate.
And Liam went over there.
Jim, don't worry about my present this year.
No, normally a token's fine.
Anyway, Liam went over there, and we have been texting over the weekend, and Liam always looks at the colour of the elections, because that is one of the things that's been going on. There's quite a lot of independence, and in fact, the Sinn Féin and Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil will have to do a bit of a deal. I think they're 2 votes short, so they'll have to get 1 or 2 independents in. The Sinn Féin were interesting. They dropped away in the polls, partly for internal corruption, but partly because they didn't have an answer on the good old question of immigration. And we don't normally associate Ireland with immigration. Historically, it was always emigration. But in the sort of areas that Sinn Féin represent, they were getting a lot of immigrants coming to live, and they didn't have an immediate answer. And you can understand with their sort of radical left position, it presented a challenge, but they did make some sort of comeback. But you know, that idea that we had maybe a year or so ago, where they'd done really well in Northern Ireland and they were looking to do really well in the south, and you know, the pressure for a border poll could have mounted if they'd been really successful on both sides of the border, that seems to have gone away. Absolutely take on board what you were saying about disillusionment. In fact, a guy who I think had a criminal record was nearly elected in the Dublin seat. So, but the net result actually is, contrary to what's happened to a lot of incumbent governments, it looks as if the incumbent arrangements are sort of going to be there for Ireland. But it's, as you say, a fairly Pyrrhic victory given the appalling turnout. If your figures are right, just over 50%, I mean, that really is very worrying.
Yeah, it's a great point actually on immigration, because that was 18 months, maybe 2 years ago. I was at an event in Birmingham with some people from Cork, and they were telling me about the disillusionment in terms of asylum seekers in hotels, and a lot of places now being sort of out of bounds to the indigenous population, and the tourist sector being really worried about the impact it has happened. So it's a great point to raise actually, Jim. was a big issue, I'm sure, in the election itself, and is right across Europe, and is an issue, of course, in France. And here we go again with the French political drama, because there is a chance, a very good chance, I understand, that on Wednesday, the government that has been in place now for a matter of months could potentially be brought down by a combination of the far right and Marine Le Pen's party and the far left, because Barnier, who has been appointed the Prime Minister of France, has put together a budget that is basically saying to the people of France, we have to start to live within our means. And the French people are saying, you can fuck right off. So what's going to happen here, Jim? Because on a serious note, we are talking about probably now the most powerful country within the EU, the biggest economy, huge population, in total turmoil, Macron's credibility shot to pieces, a government that can't function. It's going to be, I think, a huge challenge for the European Union fiscally to hold together if this thing comes apart. What happens to things, for example, like the EU budget? What happens to the single currency?
Yes, and what happens to getting France to pay attention to the boat people crisis that we've got? But you're absolutely right to draw this picture, and we have to bring in Germany as well. You've got the two major countries of the European Union, and it saddens me deeply, and I know it will Joe, as we are big pro-Europeans and want us to get closer to the European Union, but all the levers in my close context, let's put it like that, sort of saying, "Ooh, yeah, European Union's not so clever now." It really is. We're in fairly serious problems, and obviously that has an importance in relation to Russia at the moment. Putin must be laughing his head off that the big countries of Europe are in this particular state. It is interesting that Marine Le Pen is going to join, apparently, this vote of no confidence, because she'd been trying to make herself respectable for a run for the presidency, and wasn't going to do a sort of opportunistic thing with the far left, with which she has nothing in common. But apparently there has been pressure within the Front National for her to change that policy. So we're going to see her possibly bringing down the government again. And it's just going to be a period of instability. Apparently Macron could reappoint Barnier once again and keep on going until they can hold elections. But you've put your finger on it. You know, the French people, the American people, look at the deficit there. People just don't want to live within their means, and anybody who tells them that they should gets a bad rap from it. And but you know, for me, it's the European picture in general that's more worrying to me.
£60 billion worth of cuts, and what Marine Le Pen would say is that economically, actually, you can't put a cigarette paper between what she argues and the far left argues. So she will justify her decision as a vote of no confidence on the basis that the French government are punishing the poorer people of France. And it's incredible to me that, you know, such a stable country as France has ended up in this chaos. Goes back to the poor political instinct of President Macron. When he called that election, I thought he'd call everybody's bluff. Well, you know, he's ended up in a right state, really. And 1962, Joe. Jim will remember it well. There you go. Boom, boom. That's the week's Joe. 1962 was the last time a French government was brought down. So these things don't happen very often.
No, they don't. And, you know, at 62, I was but a wee thing. But, you know, what followed 6 years later were the riots, you know, the 68 riots, which, of course, were tied up in global events, the Vietnam War and so on and so forth. But, I mean, who would have thought when Macron was elected, this brand new political party, brand new, young, forward looking, he was the great hope. And we've now got France in turmoil. We've got Germany absolutely on the point of collapse, with Scholz looking completely and utterly impotent. And the car industry particularly, which has been, you know, if you like the pun, the motor of the German industrial economy, absolutely on its knees. And we now look at the rather bizarre spectacle of Giorgia Meloni in Italy, far right, being the most stable in the European bloc. And you've got the outliers like Turkey and Hungary and, you know, other countries. And as you say, you know, Putin must be sitting there rubbing his hands with glee, because if your country is in turmoil, whether it's France or Germany, where does that put you with NATO? Where does that put you with aid to Ukraine? Where does that put you when a whole load of other refugees start coming across from Syria, now in flames again? You know, as they come across from Lebanon, they'll come to Turkey, they'll come across Europe. So all of these things, whether it's immigration, the economy, climate change, they affect all of us. And, you know, never before have we needed good, stable leadership and the sense of unity that has existed for such a long time in Europe. And, you know, actually it makes Keir Starmer's argument for closer ties with Europe ever more important, because it then gives Britain a role as a stabilising, sensible influence.
But at least Notre Dame is open again. Let's give Macron credit for that.
No, well, absolutely.
That was magnificent.
But you see, things like that, Jim, he called the election and the Paris Olympics were a great success. And everybody said, you're absolutely nuts having an election in the middle of the Olympics or just after the Olympics. And Notre Dame, a huge success. Those things, they sort of go beyond politics. Those are what people say. And they say, well, he said he'd do it in 5 years and he has done. Look at that. We said we'd do the Olympics and we did. So there's all of that stuff going on. Meanwhile, you've got, you know, the anti-tourism movement that's really growing across Spain, particularly in parts of France. So, I mean, it is very difficult to see how Europe can be reset. I know reset is a ghastly word and it's obviously the word of the week. But, you know, if the French government fall, then what?
Well, you've got, as you say, Germany as well on the brink of, you know, the far right party there will do well in the election. I'm not suggesting they're going to take control of the government. They will do well. And that narrative is starting to emerge of countries whose people are clearly saying in greater and greater numbers, the European Union isn't working because it was an economic vehicle. It was supposed to provide stability and prosperity. And I know that all of us are very pro-European and we're pro-EU, but you do start to wonder whether they've overreached at times, whether some of the decisions that have been made, let's face it, by unelected officials, have not necessarily been for the benefit of the citizens of Europe. Too often have been based on what's good for the trade and for big corporate business. And it's starting to come back to bite them. And again, if you look at the German situation, and this will come to be a big issue here next year, I guess, the whole climate change net zero agenda in terms of car manufacturing. We've already seen what happened in Luton, and then we've seen Johnny Reynolds come out and say we can't have the net zero agenda costing jobs. So that's going to be a big debate next year as well. But the final point I want to make on this, just want to get your view on this, guy. If the UK would have voted 52 to 48 to remain, do we think that our influence on the EU and on those European nations may have avoided some of the crises we're seeing? Jim?
I'm not sure, because we always, I mean, the countries like the Netherlands and Sweden really valued our membership of the European Union because we tended to take the pragmatic middle route. But of course, that often antagonized the French. And I'm not sure. I mean, I think probably our influence might have been valuable there, but you know, I don't want to overdo this. I mean, you know, our membership of the European Union, telling the French farmers, what they had to pay in French citizens, I'm not sure it would have made all that much difference. But you're absolutely right to say that now Starmer, we've all got our criticisms of the way the government have got on the last 5 months. It's almost the most stable, large democracy in Western Europe, whether we're in the European Union or not. And it's important that we try and use our influence in the way that we can.
I think I'm going to probably hate myself a little for saying this, but had David Cameron's argument around immigration control won the day, I think that would have been a good thing for not just the UK in terms of our vote in 2016, but probably would have been a good thing for the European Union as a whole, Joe.
Yes, I think so. And I think, you have to remember that David Cameron was Prime Minister when that referendum was called. And if the vote had gone the other way, he was a much more easy to deal with than Theresa May, who was very awkward. And, he wasn't the complete absolute fool that Boris Johnson was. And so I think, yes, it would have been better. And I think, like you, Frank, I don't want to say it, but yes, it's something that should have been addressed in the same way as, Nick Clegg, who famously said, oh no, we won't go down the route of nuclear energy because it's going to take 20 years to come to fruition. Oh, well, hello, we are 20 years on. Isn't that extraordinary? And the immigration thing is huge. And I think it's a problem that the left have failed to address adequately, including this current government that we've got. But it's also something that has taken people not by surprise exactly, but the speed and scale at which immigration has had such an enormous impact on the whole of Europe. And it's not going to change. And the only way it will change is if countries work together instead of trying to do these offshore processing deals or whatever it is, because at that point, you're then bringing in other countries. So yes, wouldn't life have been better if we hadn't voted to leave the EU?
My reflection on the immigration thing for this week is that won't for the people of Altrincham, it won't take the Musk millions being pumped into reform to get them to vote for reform. The problems of the refugees in the Cresta Court Hotel in Altrincham are having serious implications for that community. I'm not saying I'm not sympathetic to the plight of immigration and so on, but we need to, just as a place that I know well, and the alarm and concern of people in Altrincham and the effects on the shopping there and so on is quite considerable. And in a microcosm, it points to what we've got to pay attention to, because otherwise Farage will be waiting in the wings.
Well, when we left the European Union, immigration stood at around 250,000 in the UK. Figures produced this week suggest it's going to be nearer 900,000. So if you voted to come out of the EU to stop immigration, well done. Well done. Anyway, it is an issue that needs to be looked at very carefully and more seriously, perhaps in the future, one we will come back to. Now, if Donald Trump, if Vladimir Putin is pleased about the chaos happening in Europe, so too will be Donald Trump, I guess. And I'll tell you, he'll be delighted. Nigel Farage, who you just referenced there, Jim, and he'll be able to tell us all about his delight, because he will be appearing on Thursday evening for the 38th time. The 38th time, a record on Question Time. Now, very few people watch Question Time these days, so it's not as big a deal as it once was. But nonetheless, James, as the man who supports the BBC manfully on these podcasts, come on, justify this for me, please.
You're probably really enjoying your week. You probably watched MasterChef last night, and you'll be mesmerised by Question Time on Friday and refusing to pay your licence fee on Saturday, I should think.
I will never refuse to pay my licence fee, James.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just give you a reaction as a program maker, a person who has some experience of sort of setting things up. I mean, the bald truth of the matter is that Farage is good value. He's a good guest to have. a bit like Boris Johnson in a way. You know that you'll get a lively program with him on, and whatever producers the program say, they'll give you their statistics about the representation of political parties, and they'll probably attempt to justify it on those grounds. He's good value on telly, and that's what drives television. I accept he's only got a few MPs in Parliament, and presumably your argument is that he doesn't justify these number of appearances. But he does have a point of view which is not always enunciated on the BBC. I mean, I was listening to the Today programme this morning, and there was an item about refugees from Eritrea who've actually been given the right to remain, but not being able to get council housing because it's not available, and that's what the BBC decided to choose this morning, to do it from Manchester rather than going to Altrincham and making a report on that, subject to the fact that it may have done so and I may be wrong, but that slightly sort of liberal view about things can be used to criticise the BBC, and so they're trying to balance.
Jim, I've let you waffle on for 5 minutes and you still haven't made the case. Joe, what do you think? 38 times? It's ridiculous, isn't it?
I think it's ridiculous. And of course he's good television, the same as Jeremy Clarkson, same as Boris Johnson, and, various other people. But in terms of what Question Time originally was supposed to be, how many times has the leader of the Liberal Democrats appeared? And I think, there is a question here about party leaders. Now, you could quite easily argue as a producer or editor of Question Time, we need reform. But we want Richard Tice, or we want Lee Anderson, or, somebody else. But once you get into party leaders, and also, I speak with forked tongue slightly because I shall be on his show tonight on GB News. But Nigel Farage does have his own show 3 nights a week on GB News. And I would, if I was producing Question Time, I'd say, yes, that's fine. But I think the big thing is that if you have a party leader, you put it into a different category. And so therefore, if they want somebody from Reform, they could say, let's have Richard Tice, let's have Lee Anderson, let's have anybody else. Let's have Andrea Jenkins, for instance, who's just joined Reform and is apparently going to stand for election to Mayor of Lincolnshire. But I think it's the party leader thing that I find an odd editorial decision.
Well, he will be appearing with Alistair Campbell on Thursday, so I'm sure it will be, as Jim says, entertaining. And I look forward to the BBC bringing back Jim Davidson, because the same people that love watching Nigel Farage on Question Time would be delighted to see Davidson back on our screens, and many others who've been cancelled, James. So there you go. BBC, they always have it always, don't they? Listen, it's been a very, very wide-ranging conversation today, and I hope you've been able to stick with us. Next week, we'll be talking about this government reset that were promised for Thursday, although I don't think Keir Starmer will be calling it a reset. I think it will be a re-emphasis of his missions. And there is a very important election happening in Eastern Europe, in Romania on Sunday, so we should have the results, or at least an indication of the results, when we next talk as well. Thanks for joining us again. Have a great week, and we'll see you again soon.